Ho, ho, ho! Merry Christmas. This is Cedric Youngelman, your host of the Bitcoin Matrix podcast. Today's episode with intelligence and geopolitical risk analyst Lee Slusher is brought to you by the Bitcoin Advisor. At the Bitcoin Advisor, I am here to help you get your Bitcoin off your exchanges, simplify the process, address your Bitcoin challenges, and ensure you feel confident every step of the way. I can help you set up your multi-sig and secure your Bitcoin for decades to come while ensuring you can sleep at night with the right estate planning and asset protection strategies to make sure your Bitcoin is safe for you and your family. If you or someone you know needs help buying Bitcoin and creating a multi-sig vault, I'm here to help. Head over to the bitcoinadvisor.com/Cedric. TheBitcoinadvisor.com/CEDRIC now and put some time on my calendar. The link to set up time to chat with me can also be found in the show notes. I'm more than happy to chat, explain what we do, and how we can help you secure your Bitcoin for generations. Wow. Alpa Energy Bars, a new kind of energy bar. Live life untamed. Question everything. If you don't believe everything you're told, if you break the rules, strive for freedom, reach for your peak, and don't follow the mainstream, then you're one of us. On the Bitcoin Matrix podcast, we question everything, including what real health is. Alpa bars are made with high-quality Colorado grass-fed beef, American-sourced fruits and nuts, and nutrient-rich beef tallow, so they make for a great pick-me-up. When I need some fuel for the burn or a snack meal replacement and I don't want to eat toxic fiat snack sludge, I reach for an Alpa Premium Meat Bar, the Chad of energy bars, challenging the norm and supporting freedom. Go to eatalpa.com, EATAUPA.com now and use the code MATRIX for a discount. Link can also be found in the show notes. Friends, family, plebs, pre-coiners, savvy investors, high net worth individuals, and strangers alike always ask me, Ced, where should I buy my Bitcoin? And I always send them to River because that is where I have been buying and stacking real Bitcoin for 3 years. And as a Bitcoin-only investor, I use River because they are a Bitcoin-only company that has earned my trust through their proof of work. River is the Bitcoin exchange where Bitcoiners are going. Securely buy Bitcoin at the tightest spreads in the industry. Have peace of mind thanks to their 100% full reserve cold storage custody and enjoy zero fees on recurring orders. River built and owns their own infrastructure. Your Bitcoin is your Bitcoin to withdraw at any time. If you need help getting started or have questions, River has US-based phone support for all clients. Also, River just launched a really cool new product called River Link, allowing you to send Bitcoin over a text message that you can claim to any wallet. Give a gift, pay a friend for dinner, or orange pill your friends in the easiest way possible. As the economy is transformed by Bitcoin, River's products and services will be at the forefront of that monetary evolution. Use my referral link in the show notes to get started. Earn up to $100 in Bitcoin. Your Bitcoin deserves the best protection. With Thea, you're in charge. No more fears of losing your keys or falling prey to hackers. Their self-custody multi-sig vault empowers you to be the ultimate guardian of your Bitcoin. This is revolutionary technology, and Thea makes it so user-friendly, so smooth. I mean, really freaking smooth. Like people who don't understand Bitcoin security at all smooth. Also intuitive, comfortable, and most importantly, secure. But I really like what Thea is doing to make Bitcoin multi-sig just so damn easy. Share the power of secure Bitcoin with your loved ones. Thea enables shared custody, making it a family-friendly choice for safeguarding your digital legacy. And for those unexpected moments, Thea's got your back. Their multi-device vaults with both assisted and sovereign recovery options mean your Bitcoin is safe, always accessible and ready for the future. Thea is more than an app. It's your partner in the Bitcoin journey with 24/7 support from a team that cares. Download Thea now using the link in the show notes and get your first 6 months free and experience the new standard in Bitcoin multi-sig security. The Bitcoin Matrix is proud to partner with Circle 6 Ranch, the Florida Beef Initiative, and Bitcoin Bay to offer you a taste of Black Angus beef that's grass-fed, antibiotic-free, and steeped in tradition. So, the Youngleman family has been struggling to get decent beef at the local supermarket here in Florida, and last week we finally sat down to a couple of succulent ribeyes delivered to our house by the Florida Beef Initiative. And wow, did we taste the difference. And just like Thea is helping to onboard my family to Bitcoin and multi-sig security, the Florida Beef Initiative made it clear to my family how much we need and value food, health, and energy security. And now we can get all of that through Circle 6 Ranch, Bitcoin Bay, and the Florida Beef Initiative. Discover their premium beef selections, like the Florida Pasture Beef Box, and join a movement that's restoring Florida's local economy one steak at a time. The Florida Beef Initiative and the Bitcoin Matrix podcast, energy secured with exceptional flavor in every succulent bite. Link for a discount can be found in the show notes. And now, let's enter the Bitcoin Matrix for this deep dive with Lee Slusher about Amateur-Hour Armageddon, Rubble, Rhetoric, Western leadership, and other myths.
What is real? How do you define real?
You can't jump into cash. Cash is trash. What do? You get out.
Lee Slusher is an intelligence and geopolitical risk expert with 25 years of analytical and operational experience, supporting the U.S. intelligence community and special operations, as well as the private sector. He has worked with the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory, the U.S. Army's Asymmetric Warfare Group, the National Ground Intelligence Center, and the Department of Defense's cryptologic community. In addition, Lee is currently a geopolitical intelligence and national security expert with the international consulting platform PolaGauge. Lee is a published author at the national level, accomplished at analytical research, writing, and briefing. He is skilled in a range of analytical, geospatial, and data mining applications. Lee holds a strategic security master's degree from the George Washington University and is a 3-time alumnus of the Defense Language Institute, achieving fluency in Russian, Serbo-Croatian, and Farsi. His professional education includes numerous courses at the Defense Intelligence Agency's Joint Military Intelligence Training Center. In addition, Lee is a graduate of the Counterinsurgency Academy in Kabul, Afghanistan. He completed 5 deployments to combat zones and provided on-the-ground analytical and advisory support to numerous NATO nations, as well as Ukraine and Taiwan. Lee Slusher, welcome to the Bitcoin Matrix podcast. How are you?
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm doing well.
Yeah, I'm excited to chat. I got a DM from Dave Collum several months ago that we should talk. And, Dave's always high signal and kind of has his, eyes to where the puck is going. So, I'm really excited to get into it. Your background is just immense here. So maybe we could talk a little bit about your background. It mentions that you 5 deployments to combat zones. Was that in the nature of intelligence, or was that more like in sort of kinetic activity?
So my intelligence experience, I'd say maybe roughly half of it is operational in nature. So that would be an example of it, providing real intelligence support to real world operations. And then about the other half is really more analytical in nature. So writing national level intelligence assessments, meeting with partner agencies from foreign countries, stuff like that. So the deployments were largely with the Army's Asymmetric Warfare Group, and then also with the intelligence community.
Sure. And maybe when you approach, an intelligence project, say maybe, authoring a U.S. Army handbook on Chinese warfare and strategic competition, where do you even begin?
I think a lot of that, for me, it just built over time. So when I started out, I was what's called a cryptologic linguist. So I had to study cryptography, foreign languages, and I worked in signals intelligence. And then over the next 20 years or so, I just followed a path. I wasn't always sure where it was going. I was looking for opportunities to kind of expand both my network and my skill set. And so I ended up getting kind of out of signals intelligence and more into just general intelligence analysis and national security analysis. And so there was just a series of kind of stepping stone positions where you learn the ins and the outs of the trade. I imagine much like a lot of other professions. So by the time I'm kind of mid-career, or by the time I have like 15, 20 years of experience altogether, I really knew how to go about this. And it's a number of things. First, of course, there's research skills, communication skills, but really a big part of it is understanding customers, the consumers of the information, and knowing what they don't know, because they almost never really know unless you're dealing with a very savvy customer, someone who's been really intimately involved with kind of working hand in glove with intelligence for a long time. Unless you have one of those sort of rare situations, you basically have to talk people through things because they don't really know what the full range of capabilities are, and they really don't, in many cases, know what they want. So like you brought up, a thing on Chinese warfare, land warfare. A lot of the work I've done has really grown out of sometimes just a single request or a poorly phrased question that I would then kind of go back and forth and shape over time, and go do a little bit of research, come back and say, well, I can go in these several directions. But that ability to work with clients to know, to recognize what they don't know and kind of show them the art of the possible, and also at times to quell some unreasonable expectations. At any given point in time, you have kind of the data or the evidence that you have, the intelligence information, or whether it's open source or whatever. Ultimately, you've got what you've got, and you have a certain ability to go collect more and kind of direct that collection. But that ability is never absolute. It's not, these things aren't done in a laboratory. So understanding that with the limitations of the kind of information that's either existing or that you can make exist, tempering expectations with that. So it really just came as the kind of culmination of building a lot of those skills over a long time. And I've worked with so many different types of customers, with military, with conventional and special operations, with people in the US government and foreign governments and academia, that it was a really good exercise at trying to kind of walk into a room not really knowing what the other person wanted, and being able to establish a relationship that got to the point of getting them something that actually met their needs.
Sure. Is this line of work something you were always interested in and knew you wanted to get involved in?
Sort of. I mean, I grew up in a small town in Maryland. It's a small working class town, basically pre-internet. And the things I was interested in, I mean, I was really interested in, like I'm on or off, as my wife says. And so it was history, foreign languages, foreign cultures, military matters, things like that just fascinated me. I read every book I could get my hands on. I watched all the movies. And I figured there would be a few general, I couldn't just go become Indiana Jones. So there would be a few general career paths I could follow. So like journalism, diplomacy, and the military. Well, a working class upbringing at that time, I think outside of a handful of people, the only educated folks I knew were my teachers. So, I really didn't know anybody who went into diplomacy or journalism, but I certainly knew a lot of people who went into the military. And growing up in Maryland, of course, NSA is not all that far away. People talk like, oh, you like languages. Here's a good foot in the door kind of thing. And I thought, oh, that's great. So I end up basically telling the Army that, hey, I want a spot in this school and I'll do it. And I passed all the exams to get in and things like that. But that was it. When I was growing up, I didn't really feel like a lot of people have this angst over what they're going to do, what choices they need to make. I never had any of that. Like I knew very firmly that I felt like I was being pulled on this course almost. It was never a question of whether I was going to go do something else. And so in that respect, I suppose I'm lucky, because a lot of people have to make these tough choices and go back and forth. But I knew that it would start in the military, whether I stayed in the military or went on to other things. That much I didn't know, but I knew that when I opened that door, that's where I was headed. So it was just a question of the details of that path, not whether I should be on a different one.
Right. That's fascinating.
Mm.
So there's a few topics I'd love to get in tonight.
Mm-hmm.
And the first is Russia, Ukraine. So maybe you could tell me a little bit about the context for Russia's attack on Ukraine.
Sure. So I'd like to provide a little bit of context too, as to how I know about this. My first language was Russian. I was a Russian cryptologic linguist, and Russia, more than any other place, or I should say the former Soviet Union, although my career has taken me to different places, the former Soviet Union has been more of a focus than any other. And so I was, a military capabilities analyst focused on Eurasia. I was also involved post Crimea, so 2014, 2015, when Russia invaded and annexed Crimea. I worked with the element that the U.S. Army put together, essentially to assess the Ukrainian military, to say, oh, we're now going to have this robust security cooperation with a foreign military, but we don't know that much about them, because security cooperation had been limited, and it really wasn't with the military, it was with the internal security services. And now they wanted to look at building a bigger military. So, I went over there with this multidisciplinary team. I interviewed all the people, kind of translated what needed to be translating. And I ended up writing several documents that in the early days were the foundational documents for the future of a lot of the security cooperation that unfolded in the ensuing years. So, I'm not a Johnny come lately, and I don't mean that as any disrespect to people who just took an interest in 22 or in 14, but I've been at this for quite a while. So of course, I don't know how far back to go. We don't need to go back to like medieval Kiev and Rus, I think. But I'd say, firstly, this effort to kind of differentiate Russians and Ukrainians as if they're such different people. I mean, if they aren't brothers, they're at least first cousins. They have kind of more shared than not when compared to other peoples around the world. Ukraine, when the former Soviet Union collapsed in 91, of course, it went from one country to 15. The biggest one is Russia. Ukraine is, of course, a bordering one, and much of what went into Ukraine had previously been a part of Russia or the Russian Empire before it. And during the kind of 1990s, there was, U.S. policy toward Russia. Like, Russia was essentially like a Wild West sort of thing. Yes, this is when you had the rise of the oligarchs, a lot of organized crime, very weak governance, repeated domestic security problems, like in Chechnya, for example. And so it really took. It was until Vladimir Putin came along at 99, 2000. That's when he became president in 99. And then he spent his initial years focused on kind of shoring up the situation inside Russia, bringing these oligarchs to heel, kind of reverting back to centrally appointed governors for the various kind of state level entities that are mostly called oblasts, but not all of them. But that kind of thing, where he was reasserting kind of his authority, or the central authority, for the sake of kind of bringing things back under Moscow's thumb, and also really putting an end to this Wild West era. And he did a lot of interesting things there. He took one of the richest oligarchs in Russia and put him in prison with what really were kind of trumped up charges. But at the same time, all of the oligarchs broke the law to get rich. So at any point, the government could lean on them. So anyway, by the mid to late 2000s, you've got Putin kind of consolidating power domestically. You get the oil market filling his coffers with money. He's able to spend a lot of that domestically. And this suffering and this hangover of the post-Cold War era thus far really started to change domestically. And that's when his government, by the late 2000s, started to reorient toward rebuilding kind of their foreign policy, particularly in their own neighborhood. Now, a lot of other things are happening around this time. They resume the Cold War era practice of like long-range bomber flights. They start contesting a lot of the NATO aircraft and warships that are getting closer to Russia's borders. So a lot of this stuff, it didn't come out of nowhere. It built for a long time. And of course, in 2008, we've all heard this story of NATO expansion. It continued to expand after German reunification eastward, to the point that it was basically, it included three of the 15 former Soviet republics and a bunch of virtually all of the Warsaw Pact. So at this point, we've got the Georgia War, which was a clear signal that in 2008 that the Bush administration and NATO writ large had looked at inviting Georgia into the alliance, or at least starting the process, starting the discussion. And Putin had made it clear, like, there'll be no more of this. And so the Georgia War happened. And after that, it seemed like a lot of the people in the West didn't really take a whole lot of that seriously. Like, if to the extent it got attention, it was, haha, look at the Russian military, this rickety force that kind of cruised into Georgia. And some of that is true. I mean, the military did require a lot of reforms, and it underwent some of them. But when you kind of fast forward to Ukraine in 2014, I think what a lot of people don't understand is that to Russia, not all the former Soviet republics are equal. Like, Ukraine will not be lost because of all sorts of reasons, because so much of its population identifies as Russian, speaks Russian, used to be a part of the Russian Empire, because Russia's Black Sea Fleet is headquartered in Crimea. So essentially, I'm trying to give a really 5-cent
Take your time.
review of a great many things. So I'm truncating a whole lot of important stuff. But essentially, with this westward expansion, both of NATO and the EU, the intent was to kind of bring Ukraine from Russia's sphere of influence into that of the West. And it really did. It ultimately led to a coup in 2014 in Ukraine. And there's all kinds of evidence of, Victoria Nuland and the ambassador, U.S. ambassador, kind of all being intimately involved in choosing the post-coup government and things like that. So immediately after this coup, Russia annexes Crimea, annexes it shortly thereafter because it wasn't going to lose the home of its Black Sea Fleet. And then a similar sort of insurgency starts in the east, in Donbass, in this other region that really identifies as Russian. And when a lot of people think about the war, they think it started in February of last year, but there's been fighting ongoing since the spring of 2014 in the east, and thousands of people have died. It devolved into really kind of a lot of heavy artillery, trench warfare, like almost reminiscent of World War I. This fighting has gone on for a very long time between the Ukrainian military, between Russian separatists, and early on between Russian forces. So eventually, when you fast forward through 8 years of this, there's about to be another big push by the Ukrainian military kind of in Donbass. And this is after the Biden administration has taken over, and other things are happening too. All the key senior figures of the Biden administration are talking about Ukraine and NATO and all of, just poking the bear at every chance they can get, while also kind of during this time we had built up a large army in Ukraine. And so basically Putin made a decision like this, it's not going to go that way. So I'll pause there.
Sure. Before, I guess we go further into what's happening in Ukraine. We have to talk about Putin, I think.
Sure.
And maybe who Putin is, and is Putin Russia? And I assume not. So I'm not trying to say he is or isn't. But I can't get my head around Putin. I've heard that he's part. He's past is in the mob as well, or organized crime. Maybe as mayor of St. Petersburg. And before that, I'm not sure. I don't know how much I've heard is propaganda.
Sure.
I'm not disputing that. How much is Russia behind Putin? Maybe I'll pause there.
I guess I don't find Putin all that difficult to understand because of all the time I've spent in and around Russia and Russians, and he seems like a man of the times. I mean, he began his career, of course, he worked abroad. He was a KGB officer. I think he was in Dresden, but He ends up working his way into politics in St. Petersburg. When I mentioned the Wild West of the 90s, we're so used to, at least up until recently in the US and in the West more broadly, we don't really have to break the law. We don't have to deal with the underworld. We don't have to deal with anything shady. We don't really even have to steal our neighbor's cable. Like, we can follow the rules, and for the most part, unless you're really unlucky, you can kind of make it, right? But in this Wild West period, this collapse of the Soviet Union, and before that, of course, most of the Russian people were serfs for centuries under the Romanovs. This period is very, very rough and tumble. So he's somebody who grew up as a foreign intelligence officer working kind of on what were the front lines. He then ends up watching all of that crumble, and he essentially becomes a power broker in a place in which the other power brokers are oligarchs and criminals and things like that. So this isn't a place for genteel folks, right? It's a only the strong survive kind of atmosphere, and he's a strong guy. So I think in that respect, he makes sense to me as a man who was able to survive under difficult circumstances and thrive, not just survive, but thrive. And then when we looked at the things he did that I mentioned to kind of like re-centralize power, I think the guy is a patriot. I think he cares very much about his country and its people, but we can't say that without acknowledging he also sits atop a massive patronage network that, we can talk about the existence of patronage networks in the US. I mean, you run a Bitcoin podcast. We could, talk about the Fed and all sorts of other people. And I'm not trying to draw a direct equivalence. I mean, I think in Russia, it's all roads do kind of lead to Moscow and to Putin. And so he does sit atop that big patronage network. I don't think there's ample evidence of the punishment of dissidents, both inside Russia and outside Russia. And by punishment, I mean, even assassination, poisoning, things like that, even with weapons directly, even in NATO countries, and even with weapons directly traceable to the US. So that's all back to Russia. But there were also lots of other people killed in the Gulf countries and elsewhere. So he's not a pushover. I think people in the West sell him short when they focus only on kind of the tough guy stuff, because the only successful leaders under those circumstances really are tough guys. But I want to stress that he doesn't appear to have any problem. Like, for example, he probably ordered his security services to bomb Russian apartment buildings to serve as a casus belli for the Second Chechen War. I think the available evidence strongly suggests that. So I just think he's willing to do those kinds of things. But much of what we've heard about the guy over the past year and a half, 2 years just strikes me as ludicrous. That he's crazy, that he lacks any kind of rational approach. I mean, I've been reading their policy documents, listening to their speeches, watching their actions for many years now, and there is a lot of signal in that noise. This isn't just some madman, right? This isn't a Rocky and Bullwinkle cartoon. They have legitimate interests, they communicate them clearly, and they're willing to pursue them. And when push comes to shove, they'll shove back.
I mean, I just find him to be a fascinating figure. When I hear a lot about sort of what I was trying to learn about Russia in 2017 specifically, and obviously I think the news sphere is flooded with propaganda. But you learn about things like where they might have blown up those apartment buildings, or the thing with the movie theater in the Chechen War, and those things seem to be true. And you learn about the oligarchs that kind of came out of 90s Russia or the USSR and Russia, and then all that happened with Putin and those oligarchs in the 2000s. And I think a lot of that, as much of it was projection or propaganda, I thought of that as a projection on America, or I took it as what we're trying to cover up here, because I do think we're moving to oligarchy here in America. And I do think America has probably, and I have my suspicions, done things like what we've accused in this conversation Putin of doing based on evidence that we've seen. But I want to stick to, so with Putin, I wonder, is he the richest man in the world? Is he maybe a figurehead that, maybe a party controls him and he's there because he is strong and he appears to be strong, and maybe they like, I don't understand. I mean, I don't know how the power structure works in
Sure.
another country or even here, maybe. And then I wonder if the name like Simeon Mogilevich or means anything to you in terms of like, I don't know if there's organized, I was wondering if there's organized entities behind Putin that maybe have control over him or leverage on him. The way we hear about leaders here, maybe entities have leverage on them. I mean, how powerful is the KGB? I'm sure they might, maybe they have leverage on him. Does he live in a palace? I have no idea.
Let's start with that, because over the years I've had to have these canned speeches that I use for audiences not acquainted with Russia or the former Soviet Union. And one of my favorite things to communicate to them that I often use as an icebreaker was, where does the president of the United States live? Like, we all know his direct street address. Like, maybe we don't know the zip code, but we don't need the zip code. We know it's 1600 Pennsylvania. Russians don't know where Putin lives. Like, it's a different world. And that was something I used to ask a lot of Russians when I'd meet them. Like, do you think that's strange, or how does that strike you? And it was clearly like the question of a silly outsider American, right? Because the whole assumption about, or rather the assumptions about security and power and transparency are totally different. It's when the Soviet Union collapsed, it's not like all the old attitudes and habits and, everything people have seen up until that point in their lives. None of that suddenly gets replaced with something else. Like, another one of the stories I would tell people is when you go to the post office here in the US, you can just tape everything up, and then you fill out a declaration, or a clerk asks you, like, this doesn't have contraband, right? They usually don't even ask. You just check a box. Like, I haven't been to Russia in a while, but my experience was you have to show up with everything open, and then they go through it, because how on earth could they trust you? How would they know that you're not lying and there really could be contraband? So, like, or the driver's license, like here it's a driver's license and insurance or whatever. I mean, they have this booklet that you have to flip through, and like there's one thing certifies that you're not mentally unwell because you can't let those people drive, and then there's another that you're physically well. And there's all this stuff that goes into it that makes life there just very, very different. And there are assumptions about the nature of power and authority. Like, do you remember, I forget exactly when, but there was a female band called Pussy Riot that got arrested. Right. They danced inside an Orthodox church and got arrested and sent to prison. And here in the West, it was like, oh my God, there's this big ordeal. Well, aside from kind of the Western oriented liberals within Russia, everyone else said, yeah, of course they went to jail. Like, you don't do that to a church. So it's like, it's a whole different orientation there that we tend to view in a way that's really distortive. So when it comes to, that was a kind of a long way of saying, we don't really know. Like, my personal take about Putin, that is, about your question. My personal take is that he's a very strong leader. I mean, I've already tried to fend off the criticism here. I've already said some of the bad things he did. I'm not lauding him. I'm not saying he's, going to win any human rights awards here. But I think he's very strong. If I had to guess, I would say that he's probably been able to kind of stitch together different constituencies and keep the peace versus him being controlled by someone else. But we really don't know. I mean, it's not quite like North Korea, we don't know, in which case we really have no clue what's going on inside that regime of, a third generation dictator. With Russia, there's a lot more to go on, a lot more evidence about what the country says it wants, how it acts. There are a lot more pieces of the puzzle we can put together. But in terms of, who's behind him, my suspicion, you mentioned the oligarchs. I don't know if you're familiar with the story of Khodorkovsky. He was the head of he was one of the richest men in the world, the head of an oil company called Yukos. And he was sent to prison along with with Platon Lebedev, one of his associates. And basically it was done in such a way that it was back like around 2003 or so. The trial was later, but this is when Putin is trying to break the back of the oligarchs. And essentially Khodorkovsky tried to call his bluff and say, well, like maybe we can work together, but you're not the head of, you're not the boss of me, you're not the boss of us, kind of thing. And ultimately they get put in prison in pretty horrible conditions. And as they're nearing the end of their sentences, they're tried again on completely new charges and convicted, and additional time is added. And so like this kind of thing that's it's a very transparent exercise in power. Or just recently, you may have heard of Navalny, the activist inside Russia. And again, I'm not advocating on behalf of Navalny. I'm simply saying that there were reports recently that he has disappeared within the prison system. So things like this go on, and they make me think that Putin, again, Russia's a hard place. It's a tough place, and you don't get to the top of that by being weak and stupid. So I don't really have a specific answer. Like, is somebody running Putin? I don't know. I'm not sure we'll ever really know, but my guess is that he's a very strong and capable leader who probably survives by keeping a lot of different interests happy.
I mean, it's just an unfathomable life. I think, though, that if he is independent, if he did start off his own man and is still his own person, then he had to take power. And I think that's what you do when you bring the oligarchs to heel. You're taking the power back from them, and now you're becoming a bigger person at the table, and eventually you own the table if you take enough power and sort of usurp it. It was interesting. I don't know if it was with the Yukos guy, maybe, or there was one oligarch who was put in like a glass box during trial, if I remember correctly.
Well, all of them get put in these little cages. I mean, it violates our sense of objectivity.
Yeah, it was just like
it's perfectly normal in every Russian courtroom.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't know if that was abnormal. It was just, that's the way they paint it in the media, though. It's like, this is only happening to this person, not other, And I remember sort of stories coming out of Russia where, you would see maybe a U.S. intelligence asset, a known one, maybe a diplomat, like returning back to, quarters and being like attacked by a Russian security guard and scrambling to get in to the quarters where he has diplomatic immunity. And it just seemed like they were sort of and I don't know what the case was, but it seemed like this was happening to us more than we would ever do it to them, and that it was sort of a show of strength during those years.
Yeah, I mean, look, Russia can be a very harsh place. It doesn't mean that all of it is. I mean, they've developed a lot in recent years. And there's a real civilization there with depth. It's not, we always see it in this cartoonishly two-dimensional way, and we shouldn't. There's real depth to their culture, their society, but there is a harshness there that is felt by people who aren't used to it. I mean, it's really, it can be very off-putting. But what I'd say is Russia had to make do in a world like the US led the post-Cold War world. We can talk about NATO, but they're essentially protectorates. Russia, the US has led this past 30-year long period, 32 years, I guess. And Russia really was more of an afterthought. Like the US never really had a developed policy to really build a good relationship with Russia beyond the things that on which the US needed Russia's cooperation, right? Russia was this place that provided headaches and natural resources, and the goal was to minimize the former and maximize the latter, kind of thing. There wasn't a policy to really do any relationship building there. And as Putin started to clean up and consolidate power there, a lot of the Western business interests and other NGOs and such, they weren't able to do in Russia what they had been doing and what they started to do in the 90s and what they had done to so many other countries. And instead, a lot of I think that created a tremendous backlash.
Before we get back to Ukraine, what did you make of the Trump-Russia or Trump-Putin relationship? Or, I mean, I would see videos of they would talk a lot at conferences. Or was there anything here? I mean, we could talk about the Steele dossier.
Let's start with that. Yeah. So I was working Russia at the time, though, I mean, from the United States, but I heard all of this about the Steele dossier. And I was very curious because the thing I was working on was basically explaining to others what capability Russia has to interfere outside of its borders, whether it's militarily, informationally, what nonsense or what nuisances can Russia cause elsewhere. And I was basically saying that, well, its major capabilities are along its periphery, especially in the former Soviet states. It starts to weaken when you get beyond that. Sure, they donate some money to, Le Pen and to other various European politicians. They donate to green activists because they were selling the gas and stuff like that. So there's all kinds of that. But this idea that they could, Manchurian candidate a U.S. president was so completely absurd, or that they could engineer a U.S. Election. So I remember I heard about this Steele dossier, and I went and I downloaded it. And initially, I thought I had downloaded the wrong file because what I read was so ridiculous and bore no resemblance to any kind of proper intelligence report. And it had basic factual errors too. Things that I saw, I'm like, well, Russia doesn't have a consulate there. Like this, what is this? It was so bad. I actually assumed initially that I downloaded the wrong file, and I spent several hours digging around online to try to find the right one, because surely this couldn't be the thing that had prompted all of this controversy. And that's when things really started to go awry for me. I mean, I didn't consider myself much of a dissident or a contrarian. I mean, I said what I thought about I provided what I thought was accurate analysis. So like in Afghanistan, for example, people thought I was a dissident because I was giving bad, a very gloomy picture of the future, but I wasn't inherently kind of contrarian or negative. But at this point, when the Steele dossier kicks off, and it's so completely ludicrous, just bonkers. And then the country went insane for several years. And I think that feeds directly into the war, into the proxy war, because there isn't that much time. Okay, I'll back up. You did ask about the relationship between Trump and Putin. Well, I think I made it clear. I don't think Putin installed Trump in the White House or had any leverage over him. I think that's completely ridiculous and baseless. We have to remember the sort of things that were said after the 2016 election. It wasn't, it was that an electoral Pearl Harbor had occurred, right? And that it really was that the Kremlin controlled 1600 Pennsylvania. And it's like, well, there's never any evidence of that. Of course, there's evidence that like Paul Manafort is a sleaze who didn't pay his taxes, but I could have, like any one of us could have told you that before the election. We didn't need, the Mueller report or something else to say that some K Street lobbyist who worked for a strong man in Eastern Europe probably didn't pay his taxes or things like that. So no, I don't think Putin has any kind of leverage over Trump, and I think the fact that there was a sort of, I don't want to say there was a calm because the war in Donbass continued for 4 years, but there wasn't an escalation during that period, I think in large part because of the policies of that administration. And I think there was a substantial shift because as somebody who pays attention to this every day, it was early, 2021 when the new administration came in, and all of a sudden it's not just it's Blinken and Austin and even Harris and all of these other people talking about Ukraine, not only with a frequency that seemed odd, but it was very specifically about self-determination and about NATO and things like that. And I remember kind of losing my mind. Like, are they trying to provoke a war? Because that's what'll happen. And so in that spring, people forget, in the spring after Biden took over, Putin moved a bunch of forces to the border with Ukraine again. And then after some talks, he kind of left some of them and the heavy equipment there and sent the rest back. It wasn't that this buildup began in, around in the months before the February 22 invasion. This is kind of a regular back and forth thing where it's like, hey, we really need to talk. We've been begging for years, particularly since 2008. You're going to start what could devolve into a civil war, because a lot of the tension between the people who identify as Russian and those who identify as Ukrainian within Ukraine is incredibly intense. A lot of people don't remember that, let's say in in the spring of 2014, after the whole Crimea affair, there was a lot of kind of what maybe we could think of as interethnic violence, even though they're very, very similar people, but they see themselves as different, and that's what's most important. I mean, there were people burned alive atop a government building, like dozens of them. I mean, there are all kinds of incidents of a society kind of fracturing and entrenching to the point of interethnic or maybe we should say internecine violence. A lot of that was ongoing.
I want to go back to sort of the Steele dossier. And yeah, I agree with you right away. I mean, there were even grammatical and spelling errors in that document.
Terrible.
It was terrible. And I think that's part of like the phishing aspect of the technique here. To be so bad that you wouldn't question the origin. It's just, there's something about it. But what I'm getting at though is, was this sort of a political operation, or what to me it felt like the beginning of just psychological warfare by nation states on their citizens and maybe even foreign citizens? And so that's where I don't know if Russia is involved in, getting on Facebook and seeding, strife among different groups in America to hopefully one day seed civil war or something like that. The way we could totally be accused of that with the radio service we put out to the world and the information we put out to the world for whatever we think we're trying to achieve and how they might receive that information. And you'd say, well, all of this is fair game. But I remember just being on Twitter. Well, I left Facebook and being on Twitter, and I felt like I was a subject of information and psychological warfare, and I was willing to go through it because I wanted to find out what was going on and get some signal and decipher for myself what's real and not. But I do think it's a war on our minds, to make us upset, to make us angry, to disagree with each other, whatever. And I couldn't imagine that nation states are not involved in trying to, steer these narratives at least, or defend themselves, or go on the offensive defensive. So that part of it, I still go back to and say, and I think it's gotten just way worse from the Steele dossier in terms of it's everywhere now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, on that point, of course, it's going back to I explained that I was basically working on an effort to describe Russia's kind of broad capabilities to act internationally. And when it comes to the Facebook stuff and the election interference, it's not, I remember my first thought, I think it was even before I opened the Steele dossier. It's not that Russia can't do anything. They can spend some nominal amount of money. Some internet researcher can make a chart, a flow chart, a network chart, and say, oh, look here, look at the relationships between these values and how they influence this and that. It's a question of, does it matter? Like, is it impactful? And when we look, and the answer is no in the case of 2016 in Russia. It's ridiculous. And when we look at the specific memes and the things, like, it was really low-grade, vulgar stuff. I mean, it wasn't, and it was focused largely on people who kind of already had their minds made up about things. They, of course, yeah, they did something, and maybe that served as a test bed to refine their skills or something like that, but they didn't hack the election, as some people say. I wrote something, probably my most popular post on my Substack is Rubble and Rhetoric, and I mentioned something about the information warfare campaign. And I think I link it all together from this years-long propaganda effort against the U.S. people by the U.S. government. Basically, seeds the fields for what came thereafter in terms of the war, in terms of being able to see Russia immediately as a villain. And look, Russia has intense propaganda. I'm not saying they don't. They're very good at it. They've always been very good at it. But that doesn't mean that we should relieve ourselves of any obligation to investigate and to really come to conclusions about how successful various influence operations or efforts were. And in the case of 2016, I mean, it's comical. particularly if you have like a juvenile sense of humor and you dig into those memes. It's comical in that sense. They just didn't have the capability to pull something like that off. But it really set, like when you said you made that shift to Twitter, that's around the time that I think a lot of us felt the intense information warfare campaign directed at us. I mean, I remember, I think I still used Facebook a little bit just to stay in touch with like friends and family and stuff. And I remember around the midterm, my account got throttled nonstop, and I wasn't even particularly political. But anyway, you're probably familiar with like Mike Benz. He talks a lot about the bigger information operation. Okay, I'll send you his information. But there are people who can explain that a lot better than I can. But I could certainly see it and sense it. And I don't think we would have gotten to this disastrous proxy war without that having happened first. Like Russia became the boogeyman. You know, Trump wasn't supposed to win right up until election day, right? Hillary sends this picture a few weeks before, happy birthday to this future president. Like, no, you were considered a loon if you thought Trump was going to win. And I think they set about ensuring that that sort of thing didn't happen again. So at least in terms of the Russia's usefulness in that regard, like Russia's already this intense boogeyman because, you know, some people still believe that Putin was able to direct the 2016 election.
Yeah, I mean, I feel that there's so many cards here. For me, the jury's still out on Trump. I don't know. I'm sort of I think a little bit towards the uniparty theory. And I think Trump was, if you think towards those lines, I think Trump was great for, maybe wasn't supposed to win, but they got a lot of tax breaks for the rich out of that they wouldn't have gotten through if the other side came in. And I think it creates a lot of anger on the other side so that when the pendulum swings back, it's a useful pendulum swing, I think, to use a heel and then the savior, the heel and the savior. And I just don't know. I do want to turn to just talking about these figures, though, and trying to understand how they fit into the I don't want to say the story, but what's happening, the story being about what's happening. So who is Zelenskyy then? Because, Trump, you can look at Trump and you could look at, like, say, Ronald Reagan. They've had, they both were actors. Trump has an entertainment background as well as a business background and entrepreneurial background. I don't know much about Zelenskyy. I've heard he was an actor at one point, I don't know. Can you tell me about Zelenskyy?
Sure, but real quick, I think there's a lot of reasonable criticism of Trump. When I talk about my defense of my attack on this Russiagate story, I get a bit animated. But yeah, of course, there are reasonable grounds to criticize the guy, and people are free to criticize him and specifically and to oppose policies. But yeah, this idea that Russia directed the elections is ludicrous. So when it comes to Zelenskyy, yeah, he was an entertainer, an actor, a comedian. You asked earlier about whether there was a force behind Putin, right? So there's this concept, the word is krysha, which means roof, like somebody almost in an organized crime sense. In a society in which the real power is more informal than formal, you basically kind of collect around these various powerful figures, right? And so for Zelenskyy, it was a guy named Kolomoisky, and I don't know their story to the extent that would make me really feel comfortable trying to give an account of it here. But I remember the impression that I got was that if not for Kolomoisky, we don't get Zelenskyy. That this kind of this oligarch had created the space in which Zelenskyy could become what he became. So interestingly, Kolomoisky ended up drawing the U.S.'s ire and having to essentially flee to Israel. And the best, one of the, I think the more compelling explanations is that if the West really needed to be able to control Zelenskyy, taking away his krysha, his roof, by basically kneecapping Kolomoisky, that's the best explanation that I've heard. But I tend to focus more on bigger picture kind of military and political dynamics, as opposed to some of the stuff behind the scenes with the leaders, because the information there often isn't very good. But that's the general sense I have of how this court jester basically becomes king.
Yeah, and that's what I mean, that's probably my little passion rabbit hole, especially pre-doing the shows, organized crime, mafia, that sort of allure. And I've always wondered and speculated how, maybe someone who gets tapped and is controlled can build enough organic power to then usurp the controller. Sometimes I think there could be that dynamic where someone rises so big that they can. And I think there's also a dynamic, though, they talk about sort of in maybe the mob where, there's the real power and then the front, the people that, so they put someone out in front because you don't want to risk your real power or be seen. I mean, why would you want to be? But let's turn to where we are with, and you could add anything you want. And I didn't mean to put any words in your mouth with Trump there. I didn't think you were defending him or anything like that. I got what you were saying there. But let's turn to where we are with Russia and Ukraine now.
Sure. So my view all along has been that it's completely ludicrous to think that Ukraine could defeat Russia, and that in the end Russia wins. So that basically something I wrote that I liked enough that I keep bringing it up was, in a war between Russia and Ukraine, Russia wins easily. In a proxy war between Russia and the West in Ukraine, Russia wins eventually, but with much more destruction for everybody, but mostly for Ukraine. And that's where we are. Like I mentioned earlier, I did a lot of military capabilities analysis. After, Crimea, kind of the mid-2000s, what I did a lot for the Pentagon was kind of assessing Russian capabilities and looking at its ability to influence things in the Baltics and elsewhere in NATO. And this whole, yes, the US, NATO built up a massive army in Ukraine, but the notion that army was going to have any chance in the longer run was ridiculous. Russia has a larger force, a better force. It has what's called overmatch in all areas, particularly in fires and in artillery, both like tube artillery, rocket artillery, the over-the-horizon weapons. I mean, Russia can have its troops fighting on the front line and fire cruise missiles from airplanes, from missile boats, from submarines, even not just from the Black Sea, from the Caspian Sea, all firing, going basically over the front line and pummeling targets, along with drones and glide bombs and all of that. So the concept that Western intelligence and Western aid and targeting intelligence was going to do anything but delay the inevitable and create more destruction is absurd. And I've written about that publicly. It's not a bandwagon position. I have very detailed writing on that subject. So basically right now, I think Zelenskyy will ultimately have to flee or he'll face a coup. Now, maybe he flees because there's a coup, or maybe he flees because there's one coming. But in any case, he's not part of the post-war picture in whatever remains of Ukraine. A lot of people, the military analysis, at least publicly, including coming from a lot of prominent people in the West, has just been so terrible since February of 2022, right? It's all been groupthink. This whole notion too that if we just give Ukraine enough stuff, it was all based on not just a miracle, but essentially a series of miracles unfolding in tandem. I mean, that's how absurd it was. And the people wrongly thought that, well, Ukraine is fighting for its own territory and Russia isn't. Russia's the South side aggressor. Not really. I mean, much of what is present day Ukraine is essentially was Russia, and Russia's standing up on their behalf. Russia's Black Sea Fleet in Crimea, they weren't going to lose access to that. So essentially what we're seeing is this very painstaking process of high intensity warfare in which Ukraine's not done, but it's fatally wounded. And so Russia can keep grinding forward. The question is whether they have to go all the way militarily or whether the country collapses beforehand and this kind of coup starts, and then they basically, someone else takes over and has negotiations with the Russians and puts an end to this. But no matter how this goes, as long as there isn't a direct Western intervention, which could prompt a much larger conflict, as long as that doesn't happen, Russia settles this on its own terms.
That's interesting. So I think what you're telling me is that they're grinding Ukraine down, and they don't want to destroy Ukraine because they want Ukraine. So they're doing this in a way that they don't have to take Ukraine out and wipe it off the map, and they're just slowly doing this so that they can politically sort of win when the other side like just gives in and calls for peace. I think is
sort
what
of, sort of. I think they've killed hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians. Like, I think the body count is enormous. So it's
How come we don't see any of that? I don't see any, like what I do see in video. I'm so sorry to interrupt, but what I do see in video is looks staged, and because one of my questions for you is going to be, what is the information environment for this war? Because when I do see video from Ukraine, it looks staged. It looks like reporters are not in actual hot kinetic scenes. You're telling me hundreds of thousands of people have died, and yet I haven't seen any. Where are the real journalists who are in these situations and reporting on this? I don't know what's real or fake. I just have no idea what's going on.
Well, I think the information war surrounding the information warfare component of this conflict might be the most intense and sophisticated thus far in the modern era, if not certainly with modern technology. So virtually everything that I've seen come out of Ukraine or come out of a lot of Western sources, when I look at the actual sourcing, not just the publication, but the sourcing for the things that they're for their claims, it usually goes back to like Ukrainian security services. I think we talked about Zelenskyy being a former actor and comedian. Many of his close associates, they all come from like Ukrainian Hollywood. Like there's a whole production team there. They've been very good at this from the very beginning.
He's meeting with Hollywood actors.
Oh, absolutely.
He's never in a suit. He's traveling the world. You're telling me hundreds of thousands of his countrymen are dying. He's acting like nothing's happening to me, in the sense of like he's glad handling.
Yeah.
He's doing commercials with his wife or magazine spreads. Like,
so this is something I'll discuss in like an informal like podcast like this, but I wouldn't put in a formal assessment. But first, I think that Ukraine was willing to make that deal in April of 2022 in Turkey, and that the West did come in and basically say, now here's the divergence. Did they say, no, we'll back you, you can fight them off, like we'll give you everything you need, the tap is on? Or does it go more that we kneecap Kolomoisky route and you're going to do this? Like this really isn't a request. I don't know. And again, that's not the kind of thing that I would write in any kind of formal assessment, but it's a reasonable curiosity to have. Like, did he really just say, oh my goodness, I've got the whole Western world united behind me. They'll collapse Russia's economy. They'll give me all these sophisticated weapons to go up against Russia's decrepit military, so on and so forth. Was it that? Or was it, well, we'll do all of that, but also you're going to play along? And I'm inclined to think that there was some coercion in there too, but I don't know it. And I want to be very clear. I've got no information source that confirms this. I just think the sequence of events, particularly with Kolomoisky and such, is very, very curious. So I think the guy's been playing a part for a long time. Like I said, he was basically his Krisho came from Kolomoisky, and that's how he came up. So it's not like this was some independent thinker who, although he had worked in Ukrainian showbiz, he really was this brilliant political mind. I mean, he was kind of a creation. So one of my greatest frustrations is the one that you shared a moment ago, with just the quality of the information. The quality of the information coming through, and I link it back to that earlier part of our conversation about kind of the information apparatus being directed back against the citizens domestically. And so there really has been no Western fourth estate in this war. I mean, the media is completely abdicated, as it has on many other issues. Of course, we probably agree on COVID and many other things, but in this particular case, it's just abysmal. I mean, it's so astounding. Like I never thought things could be this cartoonishly stupid, that no one would stand up and ask questions, or, that, okay, we're running out of money. Well, actually, we classified things wrongly and we found these additional however many $billion for Ukrainian weapons. Or why doesn't, all the people who've made these crazy proclamations, like for instance, about the counteroffensive and how it was going to, slice through the Russian forces and sever the land bridge and all this other stuff. There's never any accountability. Now, my whole career, there's never been any accountability. I was a younger guy during the Iraq War and stuff like that. All the people who push that, whether in Congress or the military or media elsewhere, there's very little accountability there. But the Ukraine episode is just so incredibly over the top. It's like we don't really even have to try anymore. When I say I think there are that many people dead, it's because of it's a handful of things, but they're all military in nature. So I feel like I can't get good information by relying on the people who are supposed to be the official sources. So I look at things like the amount of artillery and the type of artillery that gets employed for the length of time that it's been employed on certain fronts. I look at, to the best we can, what changes in personnel do we see on the Ukrainian side? And I've seen many. And again, intelligence, like my old background, you frequently have to make decisions based on far less than all the facts, but you've got to make some assessment based on the information you have. And so even over the summer, when I was reading pro-Ukrainian Western news outlets where people had gone to the front, I was trying to get pieces from Western reporters who were trying to relate what they saw in the Ukrainian trenches and stuff like that. And even back then, it was, guys who were well over 40, guys who were not professional soldiers, guys who had been shanghaied or press ganged off the streets. So, and I see this story repeated from independent sources that aren't working together, that aren't even trying to tell that story. Like I said, they're generally pro-Ukrainian, but I'm looking for little bits of information that seep out here and there and trying, because we're not getting the kind of information that we would want from the official sources. And it was very clear that there was an enormous manpower problem. And it was very clear, I mean, just from the videos of a lot of the independent videos of different cemeteries, that the casualty rate is enormous. And just from the type of combat that's ongoing, this is high intensity warfare. It's industrial warfare. There are sheets of steel raining down and exploding all over the place. There are, thermobaric weapons sucking the oxygen out of, whole areas of the battlefield. This is a type of combat not seen in a long time, and there's no way for it to have gone on with this intensity along a front that's about 600 miles long, although the whole front wasn't as active as the hottest spots along the front, but it's still a very long front. There's no way that Russia has suffered more than Ukraine, or that Ukraine hasn't suffered hundreds of thousands of people killed. I mean, it just, when you look at the state of their military, my view, I wrote about this, we built up this army from 2014 to 2020. We built this enormous army. If I remember correctly, it was the biggest one in continental Europe. And it was basically in response to Crimea and Donbass. It was like, this big army is how we deter. That was the whole focus, was deterring Russia. We deter Russia by helping Ukraine. Well, that army got wiped out basically in the spring and early summer of 2022. So Ukraine has to hurriedly kind of put together a new one. And we see that. We see all the replacements, the draftees. We see the new units being cobbled together, trained at various places, sometimes outside of Ukraine. Those people get wiped out. Then we kind of see this other army come together for the counteroffensive, which was always ludicrous. Like all of these people, Petraeus and all of them, who very publicly wrote articles and made videos explaining in detail how this counteroffensive was going to work, it was totally nuts. Like to even get within shooting range of the Russians, they had to come within range of all of Russia's indirect fire weapon systems, all this artillery, all of the drones, all of, the minefields. It was always ludicrous to believe that was going to result in anything except just a lot of death and suffering for Ukrainians. So it's stuff like that I use to make sense of what's going on, because we can't rely on a lot of the official accounts.
Wow. So I remember talking to Dave because he wrote his year in review for, I think, for 2022 was All Roads Lead to Ukraine. And one of the comments he said to me is, he doesn't see how Zelensky gets out of this alive.
Oh yeah.
And to your point, he's got the coup or the flee.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's that gamble where whether you're tapped or coerced into this power, where you're trying to figure out, can I maybe do my 4 years and go off into the sunset? Or can I become a Putin, a Mubarak, someone who can get lasting power and take the power from whoever put me here and rise above? And I mean, it just, I wonder how much he knows what danger he's in by the people who put him here, not from the other side, is what I'm saying, but from he's not going to get out of this alive, essentially, and that's that's that mob lifestyle that's just really hard to grok, being in that position, and how do you get to a place of safety, maybe in that, or security? And what I want to add there is, so I want to know who is this the Wagner. There was this Wagner episode where Wagner was, a big force for Russia, and they were helping, Russia advance on Ukraine. And all of a sudden, they were not, and they were turning on Putin, and there was this march towards Moscow. And what happened there, and what's Wagner today?
So Wagner was kind of a low point of my summer this year, simply because I wanted to avoid it, but people's interest in it and in asking me about it was intense enough that I basically had to say something. So the first thing I said, and I said it very often thereafter, we may never know what actually happened here in terms of whether there really was a coup. That whole episode we can kind of refer to as a rebellion. We may never know what happened there, and we may never know how Prigozhin and these other people died. It could be that just we never know much more than what it is now, and people talk about it and write books about it for years to come. That's the nature of this. My take, well, here, I'll back up about Wagner, because some years back I wrote, co-authored a handbook on Russian private military companies for the U.S. Army. And so I followed Prigozhin and Wagner a bit for quite a few years. And it's elsewhere in the world, like in Africa, where Wagner was employed, it wasn't this whole, it wasn't meant to be a unit in high intensity conflict along this huge front fighting like it's World War II. It was basically used as an extension of the Russian security state elsewhere for securing certain interests in circumstances in which the deployment of like Russian forces would have been inappropriate, right? If you deploy your military to another country without saying so, that's called an invasion. But if you've got this private military company that's, for example, going to oversee and enforce the extraction of gold, that's a different thing. That's private security. But when it came to Ukraine, basically that Putin had every reason to think that he was going to get that peace deal in April of 2022. The force he sent into Ukraine was not the force he could have sent into Ukraine. Do you remember when like Milley and all these others said, oh, Russia's going to invade and it'll be done in a weekend? Well, that's because Russia could have done that at that point in time. Like if there had been some kind of mass mobilization, there hasn't been a complete mobilization on Russia's behalf and a complete onslaught against Ukraine in this entire time. But when the Ukrainians put up a stiff resistance, particularly they had the advantages of the Defender. They had a lot of advanced, like anti-armor and anti-aircraft rockets and things like that. So Putin needed some time to regroup, and he's got his old pal Yevgeny Prigozhin and the head of the Wagner Group. And basically when the fighting ends up, when a focal point of the really destructive fighting ends up being in a place the Ukrainians call Bakhmut, but it had been renamed in 2016. It was Artyomov all up until then, because that's another aspect of this war, is Kiev basically having this sort of ethnic linguistic cleansing of renaming things and punishing people for Russianness as opposed to Ukrainianness. But so a lot of people focused on Wagner's role in Bakhmut and the fact that prisoners had been, let out of these penitentiaries and sent to this horrible place. Sure, they kind of, people forget that it's a 600-mile line, and the Russian military mans basically all of it but that. And so it becomes a really sensational story. But sure, I think the Kremlin knew that that's where a lot of the dying was going to take place. And it was a lot easier while they needed to buy time and mobilize, because they initially went in too light. While they needed to mobilize and buy time, I mean, you can send in convicts and kind of let them soak up a lot of the fighting, a lot of the dying.
Sure.
But okay, sorry, you were asking about I don't know whether this really was a rebellion, whether Russia killed Prigozhin or whether someone else did. Certain things still stand out to me. I made a small library of evidence like from Russia on that day and the days there surrounding it. One curious thing I think about a lot of the videographic evidence is it never really shows Wagner. Like somebody showing something where like, oh, Wagner was just here, look, and vehicles are pushed off to the side of the road. Or someone says, oh my God, look, and there's a helicopter, and then the camera pans away and there's an explosion, and they're like, oh my God, they shot down. So there's all of these things where it's almost Wagner, but never Wagner. And that happened a whole lot. And a lot of the other videos where people say, oh, this plane got shot down. Look, Wagner shot down this plane. I mean, the video could have been from anywhere. That kind of stuff where the evidence I didn't find of a rebellion, I didn't find compelling. I'm not saying a rebellion or, I'm not saying it didn't happen. I think characterizing this as a coup is ridiculous. The idea that they thought they were going to get to Moscow and install somebody, I think that's totally absurd. But whether this was like a soldiers' protest and they wanted to go up there and say, hey, we need things you haven't been giving us, because Prigozhin had been very public in his criticism of top Russian leaders. And that was something that was always curious to me. Why is this guy allowed to get away with these criticisms? And then there's this thing that we're told is a coup, and why is he allowed to stay alive after that and be offered like safe passage to Belarus? But he doesn't go. Instead, he's flying around Russia in like the weeks and months after, and then suddenly he's gone. I don't think that we're ever really going to know. And it could very well be that he did try to stage some kind of rebellion, or whether it was to a protest or whatever, and that they just wanted to delay the punishment, the Russian government. Or it could be that a lot of that was really not what it seemed, but someone else killed Prigozhin. I don't think we know.
Yeah, I agree. We definitely don't know. And that's what I struggle with. If we don't know about this, then what do we don't know? And it's just, that's a real obtuse thing. But when we talk about an entity like that, I think about Blackwater and how we use sort of private mercenaries or armies. What about, in Ukraine, is there an element of neo-Nazis, of sort of this?
Oh, 100%. I've seen it with my own eyes. Yeah, I mean, when I stayed in Kiev, I was basically across the street from the headquarters of the Azov battalion, and they looked like German World War II reenactors. Like this is 100% real. So why is it in the military, in the government? Ukraine's military was never really meant to fight an external enemy. Like if you can go back to the founding of the country, back to the early 90s, and there's this thing, we don't need to get into the details, but the Budapest Memorandum is its informal name. Basically, Ukraine thinks, well, we're not going to fight Russia. That'd be ridiculous. And we're not going to fight these Europeans. The Americans aren't going to come attack us. We moved these nuclear weapons that were Soviet back to Russia. Like, so they invested all of their time and energy defense-wise into their internal ministry. Like here in the US, the Department of the Interior deals with like national parks and natural resources. But in most parts of the world, the Interior Ministry has a security function, from all the way from having like a national level police force to a gendarmerie, all the way to having a full-on military whose focus is inward, not outward. And so all the real funding and expertise went into, all the love went into the Ministry of Interior Forces in Ukraine for all of these years. And so the military kind of dwindled. Like it was sort of like a post-Soviet jobs program in an economically depressed country. But I'm not saying they didn't train or that they didn't do their jobs in terms of like garrison soldiers conducting training and activities. but no one really expected them to fight, and they were treated accordingly, and they were funded accordingly. And so after Crimea, that's why it was basically this bloodless siege of the entire peninsula, because like they weren't ready to fight. So you have that kind of military situation that had to get completely turned around. I'm sorry, I can't remember what prompted me to go down that particular path. It was something you had said.
I think we were talking about Blackwater and private armies, but that's okay. And let's just we'll move forward. What is the West's intention here? I understand it seems like there's a proxy war being fought, but what is maybe the goal? Is it to destroy Russia?
So I have to give my disclaimer again that typically, like the work I would do for clients or the things I would do put in writing would be much more specific because they're things I could support with evidence or like sound analytical methodologies. The things we're talking about here tend to be the more interesting, higher level questions for which no convincing evidence really exists. So again, as two guys speculating late at night and speculating on camera, sure, I'm willing to do it. But I need to make that clear that it isn't normally the kind of thing I do professionally. But I think I would put all my bets on the following scenario. Remember, I told you that the US, basically, Russia was a place that provided headaches and resources, and they wanted to minimize one and maximize the other. When Putin pushed back on that, I think there was a similar interest in Ukraine. The reason why Ukraine needed to be pulled out from the Russian sphere of influence and pulled into the Western one was largely economic in nature, I think. And I think we have a leadership class that thought that there really isn't much propping up of Vladimir Putin in Russia. I think they believed a lot of their nonsense, that, my goodness, we could collapse the whole economy. I mean, I remember seeing the memes of black and white pictures, and they're like, Russia in 2023. Well, it turned out that wasn't true. I think they thought they could use Ukraine as the place in which to break Putin's Russia and to turn that whole dynamic around. The man who had stood in the way of this sort of Western neoliberal kind of consumption of Russia would then be broken, and Ukraine and Russia would be opened up. That's what I think. Again, that sort of broader explanation is not usually the subject of my work, but that's generally how I see things.
Right. I think we were talking a little bit about neo-Nazis when we lost track there before.
Yeah. So thank you. So basically, why are these neo-Nazi elements that are very real, why were they brought into the security state? It's because Ukraine had a military that wasn't meant to fight anybody, but all of a sudden it found itself fighting in the east in Donbass and Donetsk and Lugansk. And so they basically needed what they could get. And these like paramilitary neo-Nazi parties were, just like that. They're paramilitary, they're fierce, they want to fight. And so they ended up getting, in 2014, inducted into, some of them, not just Azov, formally into the Ukrainian security structure, so that they could then be used in the East. And so it's like, that's one aspect of it, is you have all of these neo-Nazis who kind of festered largely in the western part of the country, but they were very active, and their presence was never a secret anywhere in Ukraine. Like I said, I was staying in a hotel just off of Maidan Square, and these guys, they're not only wearing like German World War II uniforms, they've got like an old German World War II staff car. They got the boots tucked in, or the pants bloused outside of the knee-high boots, all of it. There are places where streets are renamed after Ukrainian units that had fought alongside the Nazis in World War II. There's like a whole cult of elevating this stuff. And it was never a secret outside of Ukraine. And it wasn't a secret in the US government and in Western governments during the years leading up to 2022. We all knew it. It was one of those things where everybody saw it and went, well, yeah, kind of a weird part of the world here. Like, I guess they're relying on, these really unsavory elements to maybe go fend off this Russian invasion kind of thing. But my point is, it was never treated as something that didn't exist. And then post February 2022, the way in which not just officialdom, but kind of the online world in general treated the presence of neo-Nazis has just made my head spin. Like, oh no, we went from that's absurd, Ukraine fought the Nazis, to Zelensky's Jewish, to oh well, you eventually keep going down that path, and it's like, well, all Western countries have neo-Nazis. So what are you really talking about? No, these guys are there kind of in very large numbers, and they're incorporated into the fighting, and it's just something that our leaders have looked the other way on because it conflicted with their other goals.
Then what about I've heard rumors about biolabs in Ukraine, whether Russia is exposing them or we're trying to hide them, or what is that?
I think we're going to touch on all the things that I would never formally talk about. It's okay. So again, when I went to Ukraine and all the work that I did, the formal work, it had nothing to do with biolabs. I had no idea they were biolabs. That's something I learned about more recently, along with everyone else. And it was that similar trajectory. Oh my God, that's Russian propaganda. There's no such thing. Well, actually, they're there, but they're dealing with, Soviet era pathogens from Ukraine's time in the Soviet Union. It's like, well, that was decades ago. And what we have to stop the Russians from getting those. Well, if it's Soviet, the Russians have the same kind of thing elsewhere. And they're like this whole ridiculous excuse. And I think it leaves us with the question of when we step back and we look at this Western obsession with Ukraine, it makes no sense. It makes no sense that they were never going to win the war. That as even as people who thought Ukraine might win the war are now seeing that it's a lost cause, there's still a lot of like doubling down and tripling down. Like there's this complete, like people took leave of their senses, it seems, or there's something else going on. And I think one potential explanation, like in addition to Ukraine being a place in which all of this business, Western kind of neoliberal enterprise can do business, and then in addition to that, they can break Russia. And then also in addition to that, this is a place that's kind of lightly governed by people who are very susceptible, avaricious, like very susceptible to bribery. So it's a place where things that are prohibited rather in the Western world can maybe take place without there being a direct connection to Western officialdom. And that's what I suspect is happening there with the labs. But
Right.
we've admitted that the US government has admitted that the labs are there. It went from, this is crazy to, well, actually they're there, but they're not doing anything untoward. So
Yeah. So then what do you think? Do you think Russia is out to destroy us in the West or just to defend themselves? I mean,
yeah, it goes back to what I was saying about Russia under Putin had to get its own house in order because it was a mess. And after that happened, it went to reestablish, or not just reestablish, to find its place in this new world. Now, initially, they thought that could be as a part of this US-led order, but that never really happened. So I think Russia has finally said enough is enough. We can talk about how much there has been a lot of paranoia within the Russian security establishment in particular over the past few decades of the US doing either a decapitation strike or a color revolution in Russia, some kind of regime change in Russia. So that's kind of the baseline of like, well, are they going to use any of this against us? So there's already some suspicion there of, we've tried to join your club. You haven't kept you won't let us in. You haven't kept any of your promises. You keep running around kind of toppling things. So again, I'm not trying to alleviate the Russian government of culpability and things like what it did in Chechnya and blowing up those apartment buildings and such. But I think the bigger picture is fairly defensive in nature. And it just got to the point at which all of this stuff that Russia has had to do because of the war in Ukraine, whether rebuilding its military to the point that now it's the biggest kind of most capable, most combat experienced force, in the world. I mean, there are other forces that are bigger, but in terms of experience in modern warfare and high intensity warfare, no one has what the Russian army has. It was supposed to be, this old decrepit force that got wiped away, but instead they had to build it up, and it learned and it developed and it changed. Same thing, the Russian economy, they had to become resilient to stay alive. So what do they want? I think if you listen to speeches from people like Lavrov, the foreign minister, they basically say, you'll never again do this to us. You fooled us. Like, you fooled us a number of times, and you wouldn't let us in, and you wouldn't work with us, and you never interacted on good faith. And I guess shame on us, but it's not happening again. So, of course, people talk about the BRICS and relationships with China and exporting a lot of material, a lot of energy in particular to places like India, where I think a lot of Western financial analysts or people who base their analysis on finances go wrong is in judging Russia, is that for them, it's all about maximizing the bottom line. And they can't see it as like, no, we have been under siege and rejected, and we've got to kind of create this alternative system that allows us to continue to survive. And if the bottom line isn't as big there, but it's secure, and we're not so susceptible to the whims of foreign governments, then that's a victory.
Yeah. You bring up Sergei Lavrov. Yeah, this guy is very interesting, the way he speaks, how clear he is. Do you think our proxy war, the West and Russia, has to do with the fact that Russia doesn't have a central bank that is on the system of the Federal Reserve, and that we want to eventually maybe somehow invade Russia itself and install a central bank that would be connected to the system?
I really don't know about that. I think I would describe it more broadly as opening up Russia, kind of getting rid of the current regime, the Putin regime, so as to open up the country to the type of, whatever we want to call it, investment, extraction, kind of the whole neoliberal operation that goes on elsewhere in the world, to kind of make that happen throughout Russia. As far as what that might have to do with a central bank, I really don't know.
Sure. No, I appreciate that. So I would love to then maybe turn to Israel and Gaza here.
Sure.
And how it may relate to what we've learned from Russia, Ukraine, in terms of the information environment, and how active or kinetic is this war, and is it similar in any way to what we've kind of talked about?
A handful of things there, and if I get lost in a point, I might ask you to come back to the other ones. So in terms of how kinetic it is, actually, I want to start with one other thought that I've shared in a number of other venues. If we look at Israel's goals, its stated goals, they are to destroy Hamas's ability to govern and its military capabilities. Well, that to me seems like a really ambiguous goal for a group like Hamas. Like, sure, we can identify it. It was elected, it has a leadership structure. Sure, Israel can target them. But when it comes to the military side, it's much more irregular in nature. And when it comes to the ongoing fighting in Gaza, like, how do you contain an idea, this idea of liberation or rebellion? So I don't think, like, people, it seems to me that most observers just said, oh, okay, yeah, they're going to go destroy Hamas, and they kind of moved on. What does that mean? At what point are they able to say that has happened? And I think the ambiguity there is going to become much clearer as the operation drags on, because there is no way to do that. Like, this isn't going to end with people in tuxedos and top hats on the deck of a battleship signing a treaty. Somebody will either have to declare that it's over, and then the other side will it'll be up to them. Well, do they agree, or are they going to keep fighting? I mean, it just doesn't make sense, the goal there. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind. As far as how kinetic, there is absolutely no way to drop that kind of ordinance on a really densely populated area without killing a ton of people. I endorse no particular casualty figure because there's no way to evaluate the underlying data sources, but it has to be exceedingly high. So in terms of how kinetic, I mean, you can't drop those kinds of bombs in that kind of place and not kill a tremendous number of people.
But is this ongoing? We don't hear about it in the news anymore the way we did in the beginning.
daily fighting, daily bombing, daily dying. It's very much a kinetic fight that's ongoing. I think the fact that we don't hear about it is probably intentional. In my line of work, there are a number. Sometimes I come up against certain third rails. None more so than Israel, particularly talking about Israel and the U.S. Like, people have very strong opinions, and trying to give a really kind of an accurate military assessment of the situation. There's no way to talk about it without pissing people off. It's essentially what I'm saying. But I think the lack of clarity in Israel's goals is telling. Like, what are you really going to do? There's been this operation in the north that has largely destroyed the area around Gaza City. Now there's an operation kind of in the south ongoing. I don't think I don't see. I think this ends with Israeli control of the Strip and maybe some kind of additional dispossession of the Palestinians, because I don't see where there's any other option going on here militarily. And you mentioned that we're not hearing a lot. I even saw some commentary recently, like, oh, this whole thing turned out not to be as big as other people were saying. It's like, well, it's not over. It's ongoing. Like, the battle's still going on every day. It's not now. It's not the time to try to write the history of the event.
What about Iran? Do they get involved, or are they involved? I mean, does this expand?
Sort of. So the thing that makes this one much more, like, I have a lot of confidence in how I see Ukraine going, not just because I focused more on Ukraine and Russia than any other place, but because the dynamics of that situation lend themselves to like a really solid kind of predictive analysis. When it comes to the situation in Israel and Gaza and the broader region, that's just not the case. And the reason is there are so many different actors. Like, when it comes to Ukraine, we can kind of broadly talk about the Kremlin on one side and sort of like this Western-backed Ukraine on the other, but that's easier to control. But when we look at the situation in the Levant and the broader region, there are too many other actors. Like, there's Hezbollah, there are other militant groups in the region. I mean, hell, there's the activity in the West Bank that's been going on. The Houthis apparently are being able to redirect shipping out of the Red Sea, and it looks like the U.S. is moving into position to strike them. So there are a lot of different ways that this can spiral that maybe are unexpected and perhaps not directly related to Gaza, outside of the general motivation that these people have, perhaps to fight on behalf of the people there. So I don't have any real confidence in a predictive analysis, and basically in anybody's predictive analysis of this particular one, because I don't see what I see when I look at it is an ongoing fight that involves a lot of civilians who are going to be killed or expelled or brought under some other kind of leadership regime. I know some people have talked about a multinational force going into Gaza. And even I saw I think it was the Times of Israel yesterday, that some in the Israeli security establishment have written up this plan for, like, oh, we'll have a Western multinational force. Or like, first of all, I find it just on a gut level really hard to believe that the Israeli government would allow a multinational force. Just, again, that's not a proper analytical conclusion, but based on what I've seen of them, I just don't see them allowing it. So the Arab nations have basically came and ruled out participation in any kind of multinational force. And then they're pointing to the Western nations, which are those that have largely supported Israel. And those are going to be the troops that go into Gaza after it gets flattened. Like, I just don't see any of that getting off the ground. So again, what's the end game and when do they declare victory? None of that is clear to me. And, these things with the Houthis kind of redirecting shipping, the U.S. is going to strike them. Like, there's the pressures from international commercial interests and the U.S.'s historic role as sort of the guardian of the seas and the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas and keeping them open for commerce. Like, the U.S. I think they've restrained themselves from kind of going after the Houthis earlier because they put this force power in the region to kind of deter anyone else from ratcheting up the pressure on Israel. But now that you don't have shipping, most of the shipping going through the Suez has been redirected around the Horn of Africa, all the way around Africa. So we're definitely going to fight there. But how does any of the rest of that spiral? I'm not sure.
Right. And how do you see where the pullout from Afghanistan fits into this? just in terms of the arms we left behind, how inept or incompetent it makes us appear, or not even appear. What happened? It was inept and incompetent.
Oh,
So it's not about how we
100%.
appear, but
I mean, I made a couple of videos around that time, and I've got them both on my Substack and on my Twitter feed. I did some interviews, and the incompetence here is tremendous, but so is essentially just the dishonesty. Like right around the time that Biden and everyone in his administration said, no, the Afghans can hold out. They have an air force. They have all of these things the Taliban doesn't have. I made a video and I described what was going on in the country and precisely how the Taliban would be able to retake it. And about a month later, that's what happened. So like, it's not like this wasn't foreseeable. And then I made a second video because people were going on about Taliban 2.0 as if, these people who had engaged in 20 years of combat were suddenly like some international cosmopolitan organization. So I made a second video, like, here's how they're going to rule. Here's what they want. The West is going to ignore them. It's going to go back to the kind of the way it was sort of pre 9/11. I guess I had a hard time making sense of a lot of I spent a long time in Afghanistan over quite a few years, and the impression I got was that it was forgotten, essentially. Like Obama was going to withdraw in 2013. We were going to consolidate down to a handful of what were called enduring bases. And then all of that kind of got stuck in the mud. And then it gets passed on to a new administration. I don't know.
I hear you. Then maybe we'll turn to China and Taiwan. Do you think that this is something that, for me, it looks like a domino effect, just in terms of just from a really high level, Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Gaza. I'm not saying China, Taiwan's next, but it's an area similar to those, and I think it's inevitable. And it has the same sort of maybe China doesn't want to give up Taiwan eventually ever. And Taiwan doesn't necessarily want to be reclaimed ever, but China has might. I mean, do you think that this is a spot that's going to flare up? And would we get involved? I mean, considering that's on the other side of the world, and we have these other issues that, happening right now.
Yeah, I spent several years working with the Taiwan military, helping them revamp their defense planning specifically for this kind of thing. That was in the mid to late 2010s. So my experience is a little dated, but not that much. I think China's stated goal of eventual peaceful reunification is their actual intent, in that I don't think they want to have to go to war. Now, they will go to war, but they'd go to war if Taiwan were to declare independence or the West were to kind of provoke that sort of situation. But I think they'd much rather not have to go to war and not have to destroy the place. But in terms of their interest, their perspective that Taiwan is theirs, like, it would be foolish to underestimate that within the West. Like, this is, I think a lot of people don't understand that like 90-something% of the population of Taiwan is Han Chinese. They speak Chinese. Like, the people who run it were the old KMT who fled after the Chinese Civil War fighting Mao's people, and then they fled to the island of Formosa and established Taiwan. So in terms of the US's involvement, we've always had this policy of strategic ambiguity. And it worked pretty well for a long time, in that there wasn't a war. We won't say if we're going to come to Taiwan's aid. That's the ambiguity. Like, we'll sell them weapons, which honestly we have, a lot of people don't understand we have to do. The U.S. used to recognize Taiwan and not China, and as part of Nixon's rapprochement with China, we gave up our recognition of Taiwan in favor of recognition of Beijing. But there's something called the Taiwan Relations Act that is a law that dictates how the U.S. has to interact with Taiwan. And one of the things it has to do is security cooperation. So I think if push comes to shove, China will take the island if they have to. I don't think we can stop that from happening. I know I annoy a lot of my former colleagues when I say that, particularly as somebody who worked on the island with their military, but I'm not saying it would be smooth or easy. I understand China hasn't fought in a very long time, but in all fairness, neither has Taiwan. I understand the beaches are hard for landing, but like, for the love of God, it's not far away. It's an island. They'll blockade it. There are a lot of people on the island who would be much more sympathetic to joining with China than to fighting till the end. Like, the opportunity to militarily resupply the island with a Chinese blockade, like, you just keep going down this long line, and like, what are we going to do? Have the maritime version of a Berlin airlift all across the Pacific, trying to run a Chinese blockade and trying to keep this military life? Like, China has cities with bigger populations than the entire population of Taiwan. Like, it's if ultimately China is kind of forced to move in that direction, they'll take the island. So how does this fit into the bigger picture you mentioned? I think it's more of a symptom of an ongoing illness that we have when it comes to Afghanistan and Ukraine and Taiwan, and how all of that ties together. I think we have a corrupt leadership class that basically is still relying on a worldview that's no longer operative, that no longer fits the current situation. But they're acting as if they're still holding this royal flush that the U.S. held, in the immediate post-Cold War world all throughout the 90s. But we don't, and we don't have it militarily, in part because our allies have basically turned their militaries into token forces. Our military has diminished despite the extraordinary level of defense spending. Other militaries have advanced, particularly in kind of asymmetric, game-changing ways like electronic warfare, hypersonics, stuff like that. So it's basically, it's not 1991, but our people run around acting like it is, both militarily, economically, of course. So I think all of these things you see, whether it's Afghanistan, Ukraine, whatever might go down in Taiwan, I think it all stems from really bad leadership on our side, and from people who keep playing a hand that they don't actually hold, one that perhaps they held when they were young men, or that their fathers held, but they don't hold it, and we no longer do. And so instead of kind of circumscribing our foreign policy goals that are more realistic, we just continue full speed ahead with will 1991 you? Well, we can build up this massive military and take you out, or we can, economically collapse Russia. Like that. Think about the kind of hubris involved in that sort of thing. After a couple of decades of foreign policy misadventures that, if anything, can be labeled as hubristic. Like, despite that, it's no, now we're going against a nuclear armed country on the edge of Europe. I mean, it gets worse and worse. And I think their whole world is exercised through that power, their status, the money, their whole world is kind of that foreign policy machine. And as their grip loosens on it, I don't think they're going to become more reasonable. I think they're going to become less reasonable. And that's this sort of degradation that we've been seeing.
Amazing. Then I'd love to ask you, what did you think of when America captured Osama bin Laden and brought him to justice in the way that we did? And I mean, what is your thoughts on that? And then I mean, I have to ask, do you think that Osama bin Laden was ever an intelligence asset or creation?
So first question, I was excited, thrilled, relieved when bin Laden got killed. I mean, I was an Eastern Europe focused guy, former Soviet Union, former Yugoslavia, when 9/11 happened, completely reoriented my life. Like, I went and did things that it put me on a different path. Now, in some ways, I was able to hop back on that path later, my original path later on, but I wasn't even able to entertain alternative ideas about 9/11 for a long time. So that I was on active duty at the time, it made a big impression on me. It was a long time before I was able to, really take seriously or look into these arguments, that maybe it wasn't what it seemed. And I think some of those arguments probably have a lot of merit. So but that was after Bin Laden was killed. So of course, 10 years later, Bin Laden gets killed. It was an emotional experience even for me, because 9/11 had so kind of diverted my life that it's like, well, damn, finally, finally we made this happen. As far as whether he was an asset, I'm sure you're familiar with that meme. Something happens and then like there's the Simpsons meme, like he was on our radar kind of thing. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Not that meme in particular, but I've looked into Osama bin Laden, so I'm sure.
Well, the security services come out after a terrible thing has happened and say, "Oh, well, the suspects were on our radar." It's
Right.
it's
Yeah, I
poking
know.
fun at
Yes.
that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm not trying to. There's been a lot of bad intelligence work and a lot of bad law enforcement work, and I'm not trying to cover up for that. But I think the simple fact here, like, was he ever? Well, we know we helped the Mujahideen. Like, whether that help was specifically with Bin Laden or with any of his compatriots, I mean, we helped the group. So in that sense, it's absolutely yes. It was in a previous conflict. So sure. Another way to look at this is you don't get information on kind of these dark parts of the underworld without kind of hanging out there a bit. Like, you don't get information on the organized crime by having a guy who walks around, clean shaven with a full Windsor or a half Windsor tie, wearing shine shoes and stuff like that. So yeah, a lot of these people are going to have been either reported on, surveilled, or possibly even at some point intelligence sources. And I think it wouldn't surprise me. Again, Bin Laden was a big figure in the Mujahideen. We had a years-long relationship with the Mujahideen. Whether that relationship continued after the Afghan war, I don't know if that's specifically what you're asking. Like, whether that relationship continued up into 9/11, man, I simply don't know.
I hear you. What did you make of Nord Stream?
So my initial disclaimer, I haven't seen conclusive evidence, so I can't say conclusively, but I would put all my chips on it being either the US or somebody acting on the US's behalf. I think it's completely ludicrous that Russia would have blown up this. I followed Nord Stream for a long time because of my work. Like, the way they kind of co-opted Gerhard Schroeder, the former chancellor of Germany, this took years of work, not just building, but all the laying the political groundwork to make this kind of thing happen in Germany and in Russia, gathering all the capital, then all the physical construction, all the engineering. Like, this is an enormous undertaking just to make Nord Stream 1. And then they have to push through all these other post-Crimea sanctions to work on Nord Stream 2. I think the Russians very much wanted to sell their gas to Europe via Germany. I don't think they would have blown it up. I sure as hell don't think the Germans would have blown it up. And so you have to start looking elsewhere. And although there isn't conclusive evidence thus far, again, I think hands down it was either the U.S. government or someone acting on the U.S.'s past.
Right. And then I'd love to hear, we talked a lot about Putin, Trump, some of these figures. I try not to get caught up in the person much, more the broader idea, but I'd love to hear what is, I'm assuming his name is Z, the leader of China. Is he a Putin-like figure, a very strong-like figure? Is it a different element because it's a very different culture and a very different part of the world? I have no idea. Is this someone who's going to be around for a long time, like Putin, a very strong figure, who's gotten a grip of this country?
Well, I think you have to. Sometimes people get caught up on the terminology, right? CCP, Chinese Communist Party. They're not really communist, like not in the sense of
right.
that we would read about in like a university textbook. It's basically. It's a small ruling it's kind of like an oligarchy essentially that runs the country, and he is the head of that, and I think he'll be there a very long time. He seems to me to be a very capable leader, not just domestically but internationally. Again, I think people in the West kind of have to get past this notion that they believe that someone's a bad guy, so we can't or shouldn't find an accommodation to live with him in his country. And also, we've wrecked quite a few countries ourselves. So to point to a country like China that really hasn't done that, it highlights some of the hypocrisy. But Yeah, I would expect G to be around for quite some time.
Sure.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier the thing about Putin, and he did have his own kind of roof, right? Like the mayor of St. Petersburg. Like Russia was a very fractious place at that time, so it was, I think, easier to kind of get someone over you to provide some kind of protection, and then like slowly expand that.
Right.
I wanted to say that earlier.
Sure. And then you mentioned, you touched on maybe electronic warfare and hypersonic things.
Yeah.
And I mean, um, I don't even know where to, and we don't have to get too deep into this, but like unconventional warfare, are we on par with our rivals and competitors and maybe our antagonists, or do they have things that we don't have? And I mean, I heard about these stories out of Cuba where, I don't know if it was hypersonic or making our,
Oh, right. Havana
different kinds of
syndrome.
things going on. And I don't know if that was projection or propaganda or we do that, they do that, but like, what about this unconventional warfare? I mean, how advanced is this? Do our enemies have capabilities that we don't have?
Um, well, I was referring specifically to the kind of electronic warfare that occurs in a conventional fight.
Hmm.
And that's incredible. That is pivotal to a conventional fight. It's just that we kind of forgot about it. Like after 9/11, we got involved in these wars, and the IED, the improvised explosive device problem, became really large. We kind of retooled our whole electronic warfare apparatus to be counter IED. Like how, whereas before then we understood you've got to jam people's signals, you have to spoof them, you have to find ways, particularly as weapon systems become more sophisticated, you have to find ways to throw off their precision navigation and targeting. Like there are all kinds of things. You have to kill these drones. It's called soft kill. You don't have to shoot drones down. You can kill them with electronic warfare. Shooting them down is hard kill. Killing them with electronic warfare is soft kill. Like that kind of thing. And a lot of it goes back to this 1991 again. The US built this massive military and had over a month, many months and used it to invade Iraq. And that kind of joint warfare capability where you have like land, air, sea, all of that working together, no one else could rival us back then. Now we don't have that capability anymore because we and our allies have largely let it dwindle. But other countries, like namely Russia and China, saw that and said, well, we're not going to be able to build up that kind of conventional joint capability, so we need to invest elsewhere. And they weren't starting from scratch. The Soviets always had good electronic warfare, but they focused on areas where maybe they could compromise our overwhelming conventional kind of joint capability. And another thing that scared them was our joint strike capability. Like we can strike targets all around the world with conventional weapons, with non-nuclear weapons. We can have B-52s that are, older than both of us, take off from Louisiana and with aerial refueling, go to the other side of the world, bomb targets, and return to Louisiana without ever having touched down. Like it's that kind of stuff that got other countries to look. And now you see, like massive proliferations in EW, electronic warfare, and drones in particular. I mean, Turkey is selling drones and drones with they're developing drones with precision guided munitions. That's another part of this proliferation is, it used to be the rich countries had the air forces, and like the Western way of war was dependent upon establishing air superiority that you could then use to cover all of your activity on the ground. Well, now all around the world, countries can have the poor man's air force, the drone air force, the kamikaze drones, the fire and forget weapons, the surveillance drones. All this stuff is proliferating. And a third component of that is precision, the proliferation of precision guided munitions, some of them fired by unmanned systems. This stuff is all being developed in a way that we've never seen. It's being sent all around the world. And all of that does, in fact, compromise a lot of the combat capability. Because when we think of the US as being powerful, what a lot of that meant was our ability as an expeditionary force to take a bunch of a huge combat power, put it on the other side of the world, sustain it, and have it just blow the hell out of things. Well, other people are able to contest a lot of that if you no longer have the air superiority, if you're not the only person with precision guided munitions, if perhaps their electronic warfare can defeat some of your systems. And we're seeing a lot of that develop. But all of these countries, our adversaries in the US, they all have things that we, the general public, have not seen. I mean, of course.
Yeah, fair enough.
But yeah.
Do you think that nuclear war is something that might happen in the near term, just the way things are trending?
I only see one path to nuclear war, and I wrote about it in a piece I titled Amateur-Hour Armageddon. And that path would be if there is a direct Western military intervention in Ukraine because Ukraine is failing, but the Western powers decide that they need to intervene, not through a proxy war, but through a direct conflict with Russia, that could lead to a nuclear exchange. I mean, I think Russia's military doctrine on the use of nuclear weapons is very clear. I think there's also, I mentioned that kind of paranoia about a decapitation strike against the Russian regime that they've had for a long time. Any kind of US operation in Ukraine would require the initial kind of steps that would be also used in a decapitation strike, right? You'd have to suppress enemy air defenses. You'd have to kind of pass through their lines, things like that. So that would be, but that all hinges on whether there is a direct Western intervention. Absent that, I don't see any kind of near-term nuclear usage.
Right. So I guess my final question for you, which is kind of two-part. There was a video that I saw maybe in 2016 or 2017, and I don't recall the person speaking, but he was someone who fled Russia. He was an intelligence agent, and he went to Canada. And it was in the late 70s. Rebuilt his life there. Do you know the video I'm talking about? And he talks.
Yeah, he's famous. Sure.
Yeah, maybe you know his name. Then I'm trying to remember his name.
Ordinarily, it rolls right off my tongue. I think
I know what you mean.
10 o'clock on a Sunday. I think I can't remember.
But it's like a 15-minute video, and he's in Canada, and he's talking about how he fled Russia, but that Russia is going to destroy America from within.
Oh yeah, I know what you're talking about. Go ahead.
And so my thought there is there some sort of long game here, whether it's an enemy from within or a foreign enemy, but that kind of thing is happening, where we're being destroyed from within, whether it's external forces pushing us in that direction or not. But what he talks about there is, through information warfare, basically on the people, that you dumb the people down. I think you make them angry, and the society disintegrates from within, essentially tears itself apart.
Well, that was the Soviet view, because the West, the capitalist West, was very decadent, lacked discipline, was kind of weak. They just had a lot of money for weapons, and right, that was the whole view. So that's and he defected during the Soviet Union, during the Cold War, rather.
Right.
And so his view is reflective, or his comments were reflective of that kind of Cold War era view that the decadent West is going to ruin itself. Now, some of that continues on into current Russian thinking, into a lot of the remarks that Putin has made about the West and about Europe in particular. But as far as the long game thing, here's what I want to say, because a lot of people say this in many different situations. There are ideas that are popular that kind of sometimes move to the background or the back burner, depending on world events and depending on who's in power at a particular place and time. And then they get revived repeatedly over history. And it's easy to take the 30,000-foot view and look at that and see, oh my God, that was the plan all along. Like, people go back to Ukraine and after World War II and say, oh man, Operation Paperclip, they were trying to compromise Ukraine at that time. And then you fast forward to Brzezinski and the world chessboard and him talking, oh, we've got to carve off Ukraine. And then you fast forward to like things that have been happening since in the past 8 or 9 years. And the reality is a bunch of different people have been in power during that time. And the world changed a lot. And some of it's a lot of these ideas that are popular and kind of regain popularity repeatedly over time. They're also not really on people's minds during other times. Like, it's not the case that there's always this concerted effort. And I think that dynamic applies to what you're saying about the long game, because the man you're talking about came over very much with the like height of the Cold War communist view of decadent America. And that idea has been revived now, but it was not the prominent idea throughout the 90s and the 2000s. It wasn't there when, Yeltsin and initially Putin thought that they would have a much better relationship with the US. It's that thing that gets revived. And now why does it get revived? Well, probably because some of the underlying assessments are accurate. Some of, or at least the underlying assessments of weaknesses are likely accurate. Just like in our assessments of Russia, I mean, it is sort of autocratic in some ways, and there are some carryover. It's not the Soviet Union. We shouldn't treat it as such. A lot has changed, but like some of these old ideas get revived again because you're dealing with something that seems familiar. And I think Putin and others see that now. They make a lot of hay about the cultural issues, particularly about sex and gender and stuff like that. I mean, Putin and the Russians, even 10, 12 years ago, they would refer to gay-ropa instead of Europa. And, they would go on about how Russia has sort of revived its spirituality that was dead during or at least dormant during the era of the Soviet Union. And so part of what they try to do is position themselves as the standard bearers for Christianity and for a moral society, and then they point out a lot of the things going on in the West and say, see, we've been saying this a long time. Like it connects back to that old Soviet era message.
Yeah,
even though it wasn't always there. Even though in the 90s they wanted to be, kind of with us. It wasn't, oh, you decadent Westerners are going down. It's like, hey, let's do business, and
right,
much different.
So my final question is, do you see Bitcoin playing into any of this economically, and just in terms of these nations trying to move away from SWIFT or, transacting in the dollar to give, America power in terms of, being able to export inflation and, print money and take assets? Russia's known for its hard assets, its minerals, its, resources, if you will. And these other nations, are looking to get away from the dollar. Maybe. What do you see there with Bitcoin or just alternative options?
Well, I think the focus will largely be on alternative options. Here, I've been asked this kind of question a number of times, and I always start by saying, what's the important thing to recognize now is that there's a concerted effort to build alternative systems. Now, a lot of people, like I'm sure you've heard, like Brent Johnson's arguments about the the dollar milkshake and all that stuff. A lot of these arguments, my comments are focused on the fact that serious people are making serious efforts to build these alternative systems. It'll take time. We don't know which of those are going to be successful. The dollar still has, a tremendous deal of power, but I don't think, when you consider the extent to which the West and the US in particular has abused a lot of these privileges, I don't think there's another life left in that. I think these alternative systems will be made. And it's like I said before, even if the bottom line isn't as great as it might be in kind of this US dollar-led system, there could be a certain kind of resilience or security or insulation from the manipulation of foreign powers that I think is going to cause, whether it's Bitcoin, other crypto, gold, all of this stuff. I mean, Russia has a very favorable, I haven't dug into this too much, but there's a lot of favorable view on the use of, a lot of favorability on the use of crypto. I mean, I just saw another story about, I think it was about Bitcoin specifically, just a day or two ago from Russia. So it's just, those are the other options on the table. Now, which one might become dominant over the others, I wouldn't even pretend to know.
Sure. This has been incredibly awesome, Lee. You've definitely, filled me and informed me on a lot that I've wanted to ask questions about. So I'll leave it to you for any parting words. And I didn't mention that, you are the CEO of BT Consulting. So let us know where we can find you and your work. And I do love your articles that are on Substack. So, definitely, share where we can find you.
Sure. Everything is on my company website, which is lee-bt, so lee-b as in Bravo, T as in Tango.com. That's got all the articles, all the videos, the services I offer, my background. I'm on Twitter at Lee BT Consulting, I think. And then my Substack is Deep Dive with Lee Slusher at substack.com.
This has been so dope. Thank you so much, Lee.
Thank you.
Hey, that's a wrap on today's episode of the Bitcoin Matrix podcast with the insightful and candid Lee Slusher. I hope that you found it as informative and enlightening as I did. Hit us up. We'd love to hear your feedback. I want to thank you for tuning in. Please keep in mind that I only work with the best sponsors and that they are a big reason I can deliver this content to you for free. So I hope that you will support our sponsors, Alpa for energy bars, River to build your Bitcoin wealth, Thea for multi-sig that's super mobile friendly and secure, the Florida Beef Initiative for succulent grass-fed beef. And you can also find me at the Bitcoin Advisor, where I'm a phone call away to help you with all your Bitcoin needs. Finally, if you could write a 5-star review for the Bitcoin Matrix podcast, wherever you dome your pods, that would really help to get the word out and help new listeners to find the show. Keep building, keep stacking, always stay laser focused out there, and let's work to free Ross. You can go to freeross.org and sign the petition. This is Cedric. Peace.